My name is Norman Willis. I'm with NazareneIsrael.org. And to me, there's nothing more important than learning about what Scripture says and living according to its truths. Now, you might be Christian or you might be Messianic, but today I want to talk with you about the book of Revelation and the end times. Revelation is particularly difficult to talk about because in prophecy, and particularly in visions, everything's all interconnected and overlaps, and various themes are interwoven throughout. And we're going to see that the book of Revelation is this way. You might not agree with everything I have to say about this presentation, and that's okay. The only thing I'm going to ask is that you please search the scriptures for yourself. Check these things out in your own scriptures and pray about it. Make up your own mind about what I'm presenting today. In this presentation, I'm going to use the original Hebrew names and terms. You might say the Lord, or you might say Jehovah. I'm going to use his original Hebrew name, Yahweh. You might say God. I'm going to say Elohim. You might say Jesus. I'm going to say Yeshua. There's the reasons why we believe these things are important. We explain on NazareneIsrael.org. Just letting you know what I'm going to do. Originally, I got saved in the summer of 1999, and at that time I was taught about Y2K, and everyone thought the world was going to come to an end at midnight, December 31st, 1999, and you might have heard something about that. I was also taught at that time, I was taught about what's called a pre-tribulation rapture. We were told that the believers are going to be raptured out in the year 2000, and then it's going to be followed by 7 years of tribulation. They were taught the Messiah, Yeshua, or you might say Jesus, would come in the clouds, and he would take us all back, scoop us all up, catch us up in the clouds, and take us all back to the land of Israel supernaturally, where we'd rule and reign with him with immortal bodies for 1,000 years, sitting on thrones, 144,000 of them lined up to his left. And it was a very beautiful scenario, and part of me really wanted to believe that. And, so here I am, I'm waiting, and it's December 31st, and I'm waiting in midnight. So 1999 came and went, and then the year 2000 came and went. Then the year 2001 came and went. And then we had the 9/11 scenario with the Twin Towers and the planes flying into them and this sort of thing. And then 2002 came and went, and I started to have some questions about the things that it was that I'd been taught. So because I had these questions, I started studying deep into the book of Revelation. I just wanted to know the truth because the things I'd been taught hadn't come to pass. So I wanted to study the book of Revelation to see what Scripture, what Revelation really had to say about the end times. My original question at that time was, when is the rapture? Was it a pre-tribulation rapture? Was it mid-trib? Was it post-trib? What was it? The problem was that as I kept studying, I started to see a number of things that didn't line up at all with the things that I'd been taught. What I saw was, as I studied Scripture, I began to see a number of things that were extremely different than what I'd been taught, kind of like I was trying to put the square pegs that I'd been taught into these round holes called Scripture, and it wasn't working for me. And as I kept studying and reading and learning and growing, what I began to realize is that the things I was being taught required that certain of the prophecies would go forever unfulfilled. Now, in my understanding, you can't do that. That's a no-no. In John chapter 10 and verse 35, Yeshua tells us the scriptures cannot be broken. He says, if he called them Elohim, or gods, to whom the word of Elohim, or God, came, and the scriptures cannot be broken. He also tells us not to think that he came to do away with any of the prophecies over Israel. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, he says, do not think I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but only to fulfill, or only in fulfillment of them. He said, for assuredly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle, the least smallest thing, will by no means pass from the law or the Torah, till all is fulfilled. This tells us we can't just throw out certain prophecies if they don't match up with our theories about the end times. If our theories about the end times don't match up with Scripture, it's our theory that has to go in the trash can. Again, I was taught that Yeshua was going to return in the clouds in the year 2000. He was going to scoop us up in a rapture and carry us back supernaturally to the land of Israel, to Jerusalem. That he would rule and reign on earth for 1,000 years during what's called the millennium, and that we'd have immortal bodies ruling with him. Further, I was told that Yeshua would be the prince of Ezekiel's temple in Ezekiel chapter 46 through 48. We know that Ezekiel 40 through 46 speaks of a coming temple in which a prince will serve all of Israel, and he'll lead them in a renewed temple services. But as I started reading and studying, I saw some problems. For example, in Ezekiel chapter 45 and verse 22, it says, "And on that day the prince shall prepare," and we'll look at this in more detail later, but he says, "And on that day the prince shall prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bull for a sin offering." As I read that, I thought, well, why does the Messiah need to prepare a sin offering for himself? So, can that prince be Yeshua? And if that prince is not Yeshua, then how could he rule simultaneously at the same time the Prince of Peace, or the Sar Shalom, was in the land of Israel? Wouldn't it create some kind of a conflict to have two persons ruling and reigning over Israel at the same time? One of them being a human being, and another one being an immortal being, Yeshua. It didn't make sense to me. In Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 8, Yahweh, you might say Jehovah, but Yahweh says, "I am Yahweh, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images." So we know he's not going to share his glory with any mortal human being. So it doesn't make sense to me that you can have a human ruler at the same time as you'd have an immortal ruler, Yeshua, being right there in Israel. If we take a look and kept reading in Ezekiel chapter 46 and verse 16, he says, "Thus says Yahweh Elohim, if the prince gives a gift of some of his inheritance to any of his sons, it shall belong to his sons. It is their possession by inheritance." So when I read that, I had to stop and I thought, well, wait, is Yeshua going to take an earthly wife and have earthly sons? That doesn't sound like the Yeshua I know. But if that's not Yeshua, then who is it? So does it make sense, once again, the same question all over again. Does it make sense that Yeshua would physically be here for 1,000 years ruling and reigning, sharing his glory with a mortal human being, a mortal prince? Perhaps you've been taught this, that Yeshua is going to catch us all up in a rapture and take us all back to the land of Israel in a cloud. But as I kept reading, I wondered, how does that match with verses like Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 20, which says, "Then they shall bring all your brethren for an offering to Yahweh out of all nations, on horses and in chariots and in litters, on mules and on camels, to my set-apart mountain Jerusalem," says Yahweh. Perhaps we can imagine that the horses, chariots, litters, mules, and camels might be a reference to the planes, trains, automobiles, and buses of the modern era. But what part of that says Yeshua is going to take us back to the land of Israel in a cloud? So there's other questions, but we need to do a basic review of two-house theory before we see the rest of the verses well, and there's many of them, before we see some other verses that don't match up with the standard premillennial dogma. So let's just do a basic review of two-house theory. At first you had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who is also called Israel. And Israel had 12 sons. One of Israel's sons was Joseph, and Joseph was sent down into Egypt. After 430 years, Moshe, or Moses, brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Then came 480 years of judges, and after that we had kings David and Solomon, and after that the kingdom split, and you can read all about that in 1 Kings chapters 11 and 12. What we need to understand is something called two-house theory. Now this is a basic. There were 12 tribes of Israel, and what happened is that the 12 tribes were divided up into two houses. There was what's called the House of Israel, also called Ephraim, in the north, and that comprised of 10 of the 12 tribes. There were two tribes that remained in the south, and those were called the House of Judah. They were the Jews of today. As we take a look throughout Scripture, we have to understand this parallel, this two-pronged axis kind of a thing. Now again, the 10 tribes in the north were called the House of Israel, also called the House of Ephraim, and they were taken into what's called the Assyrian diaspora, or the dispersion. There was also two tribes in the south, and they're called the House of Judah, or Jacob. They were taken into the Babylonian exile. They were the Jews of the first century. They went through the Roman exile of 70 CE, and their descendants are also the Jews as we think of them today. But the Jews of today are not the descendants of all 12 tribes. They're only the descendants of the two tribes. So we have to keep this 10 and 2, these two houses, separate in our minds. Yeshua knew the difference, and he knew the distinction, because in Matthew chapter 15 and verse 22, Yeshua answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel," or the Ephraimites. He's speaking about the 10 tribes, and this is why the Jews of his day didn't follow him, is because he wasn't sent to regather them at that particular point in time. But we know the apostles also were aware of this difference. In Yaakov, or James, chapter 1 and verse 1, he says, Yaakov, or James, a bondservant of Elohim and of the Adon Yeshua Messiah, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. Greetings. So he's writing to the tribes which are scattered. Also in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 1, he says, Kepha, or Peter, an apostle of Yeshua Messiah, to the pilgrims of the dispersion, meaning the lost 10 tribes, in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. We know that the 144,000, which we're going to see later in this presentation, they come from all 12 tribes. Revelation chapter 7 and verse 6, it says, and of the tribe of Asher, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000 were sealed. These are not Jewish or Judaic tribes. They're Israelite tribes. Okay, I said all that to say this. When we look in Jeremiah chapter 3 and verse 18, it says, in those days the house of Judah shall walk with the house of Israel, and they shall come together out of the land of the north, to the land that I have given as an inheritance to your fathers. What part of that says Yeshua is going to take us back to the land of Israel in a cloud? And we know in Hosea chapter 1 and verse 11, it says, then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together. This is a future prophecy. And shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. When the two houses appoint their leader, doesn't that speak of an election? My question was, well, wait a minute. When Yeshua returns, are we going to elect him? Okay, if you can picture the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the conquering king touching down on earth, and he's going to stop and say, wait a minute, boys, I need you to hold an election so I can rule and reign over you? Doesn't make sense to me. So this particular passage has to be a human being, and we have the same question as before. If Yeshua is here, why would the people elect a human leader? But we know that the people, the children of Israel, are going to elect a human leader because prophecy says so. Now let's consider. Yeshua returns in the clouds. So in Acts chapter 1, starting in verse 9, it says, now when he had spoken these things, as they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And when they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them in white apparel, who also said, men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven? This same Yeshua, who is taken up from you into heaven, will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven, meaning he's going to come back in a cloud. But if Yeshua is going to come back in a cloud, then let's take a look at passages like Jeremiah chapter 30, starting in verse 7. It says, alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It's the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. For it shall come to pass on that day, says Yahweh of hosts, that I will break his yoke from your neck, and will burst your bonds, and foreigners shall no more enslave them. But they shall serve Yahweh their Elohim, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. Now we basically have 2 options here. One option is that the original King David with olive skin tones is going to be physically resurrected from a grave. Another option is that we have that someone's going to come in the power and spirit of King David, much like John the Baptist came in the power and spirit of Elijah. But if Yeshua comes down in a cloud, then who is this King David that's raised up, who's going to rule over the nation of Israel? Let's drop down a few more verses. Let's drop down to Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 21, where it tells us, their leader shall be from among them, and their governor shall come from their midst. So once again, we have the same basic question. If Yeshua returns in the clouds, then who is it who comes from among them and from their midst, perhaps that is raised up? So the more I kept studying, reading, and learning and growing, the more passages, and we've only shown a fraction of them here, the more passages that I saw that just don't fit with the standard basic rapture paradigms. It's like puzzle pieces that don't fit into the puzzle. And then you can throw out the whole puzzle, you can throw out the pieces, but what we really need is to find a way to make all the pieces fit. And I'm going to show you more verses we have to consider as things go along. Now, I'm just going to present to you the results of my studies. I'm going to offer you a basic idea as to how things might work. You don't have to agree with me, but if you'll allow me, if you would please, just let me paint a picture for you and see if it makes sense to you. What I found in my studies is that the book of Revelation has a timeline built right into it, and all the rest of the end time prophecies plug right into that timeline. It's extremely convenient, and it answers a lot of questions. And the way we get there is just like you'd solve any puzzle. First you find the four corners, and then you fill in the border, and you kind of get a framework, and then you start piecing together the parts of the puzzle that go in the middle. Now, we may not have the entire puzzle figured out in the middle, but I believe we have the four corners, and I believe we have the borders, and we have a lot of the pieces of the puzzle that go here in the middle. We're still learning and growing, but I wanted to get this information out to you because I thought it would be important. Here's the full chart. We're going to refer to it from time to time, and you can find it again on the Nazarene Israel website. Now, here's the simplified chart, starting with the assemblies. This is also on the website. We're going to talk about this chart a lot more. Now, what we're going to see in this study is we have seals, trumpets, thunders, and cups, also called bowls. Now, the seals take a long time to play out. The trumpets, which is also the tribulation, take approximately 7 years. The thunders are sealed up. We don't know exactly what happens during the thunders, but we do believe that those take place in the second half of the trumpet period. And that's also called the time of Jacob's trouble. And the cups or the bowls happen fairly quickly. We're not going to talk about the 7 assemblies in this presentation because we don't have time, but we do cover them in the book, and it's also on the website. Before we get started, I need to talk about the difference between the timeline and the inserts. Now, the timeline is basically the storyline. It talks about those things that happen in sequence, or they happen chronologically. First this happens, then that happens, and the next thing happens. But there's also blocks of information that are sort of overlaid on or inset into the timeline. These provide more information. They'd be sort of like a flashback you might watch in a movie or something like that. But let's take a look at this chart. Look at the simplified chart. At the top you have the row of assemblies. We're not going to talk about those. Then you have the insets. Some of the insets, they provide us more information. Is the 144,000, there's the 2 witnesses, we have an inset about the frogs, these kinds of things like that. There's also inset chapters that take place between the thunders and the cups, and between the cups and Armageddon, and we'll talk more about those as we go. Now the seals, we're going to see the seals are basically releasing forces. We're going to talk about the horse forces, and again those take a long time to play out. Then we have an inset, we have the 144,000, we'll talk about that in more detail. Then we have the trumpets. There's 7 years of tribulation, and the last 3.5 years is the time of Jacob's trouble. Again, we have 7 thunders, and the 7 thunders are sealed up. They take place, or they're given to us during trumpet 6, but we believe that they play out either during trumpet 6, but in any case, during the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, which is the time known as Jacob's trouble. Now, we also have inset chapters between the thunders and the cups. And then we get to the cups or the bowls. And again, these play out fairly rapidly. We'll see they play out in about 30 days. Then we have inset chapters after the cups before we get to Armageddon. And then we get to Armageddon. We're going to talk about this a lot more. It might sound kind of counterintuitive, but Armageddon is also the wedding feast. This is Revelation chapter 19. This is also when Yeshua returns. We're going to talk about that a lot more. After Armageddon, we have the ingathering, also called the second Exodus. Then there's a 1,000-year period of time called the millennium. This is when Ezekiel's temple is built. We'll talk about this in a lot more detail. At the end of the millennium, Satan will be released, and that's the time for the second war of Gog and Magog. And after that comes the time of the new heavens and the new earth. We're going to refer to this chart many times. We're going to go over all that information all over again. But the timelines begin with seal number 1. Now the seals basically introduce forces, and they're going to introduce us to a cast of characters. And this cast of characters is 4 main spiritual forces that are going to interact. They're going to conflict with each other here on earth. And it's going to provide the drama or the backdrop for everything that we see today. Seal number 1. Each one of the seals introduces a different color of horse, and these horses are spirits. Now it's interesting, the horses also show up in Zechariah. So before we get into Revelation, I want to take a look at the horses in Zechariah first. Now the 4 horsemen of Zechariah, as we're going to see, you have a red, a black, a white, and a dappled or a pale, and in Revelation it'll show up as a green horse. The red horse is basically communism, socialism, and democracy, as we're going to see. The black horse is capitalism and free market economics. The white horse is the church, and the white horse follows the black horses around. The white horses follow the black horses around. And now the dappled or pale in Revelation, the green horses are associated with Islam, which is also what they might call submission to the will of the Spirit. We're going to talk about those more as we go. Now in Zechariah chapter 6, starting in verse 1, it says, "Then I turned and raised my eyes and looked, and behold, 4 chariots were coming from between 2 mountains, and the mountains were mountains of bronze. With the first chariot were red horses, representative of Marxism, and with the second chariot, black horses, representing capitalism. With the third chariot, white horses, and with the fourth chariot, dappled horses, strong steeds. Then I answered and said to the messenger who talked with me, What are these, my master? And the messenger answered and said to me, These are 4 spirits of heaven, who go out from their station before the master of all the earth. The one with the black horses is going to the north country, and the white horses are going after them, and the dappled horses are going towards the south country. Then the strong steeds went out, eager to go, that they might walk to and fro throughout the earth. And he said, Go, walk to and fro throughout the earth. So they walked to and fro throughout the earth. And he called to me and spoke to me and said, See, those who go toward the north country have given rest to my spirit in the north country. What's important about this, if we understand what the horses represent, that the black horses represent capitalism and free market economics, looking for money basically, and the white horses represent the church, what we can see is the basic pattern is how the Judeo-Christian Western civilization spread. First we had people going forth. In the days of the Roman Empire, they were looking to conquer militarily, and then they brought their religion with them. Then later in the days where you had the Protestant European countries would send out their colonies, first they would go forth looking for gold, silver, new lands, timber, basically money and material resources for the crowned kings that they served. And once again, they brought their religion with them. So this is what we see, is that the black horses go first looking for money, and the white horse comes with them. Now, Yahweh says that this gave rest to his spirit. That's a very important principle. We need to understand that. So now let's shift gears here. We're going to take a look at the 4 horsemen of Revelation. We're going to see the same 4 horses, but they're going to be presented in a different order. First, you have the white horse, which is the church. And again, went after the black horses. You have the red horse, the black horse, and again, the dappled pale, or in this case, the green horses. Let's take a look. We're going to zoom right in here. We're going to take a look at the first seal and the white horse. We're going to see that it's representative of the papacy, and also later on, we're going to see this representative of the United Religions Initiative, and even in some cases, the New World Order. In Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1, it says, Now I saw that when the Lamb, notice it's the Lamb opening the seals. Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, representing power. And he went out conquering and to conquer. Now let's take a note. The Pope dresses in white. Now, Rome's armies historically went forth conquering and to conquer. That's how Rome spread. Now, Yeshua also rides a white horse, and we're going to see Yeshua's white horse show up in Revelation chapter 19 and verse 11. But this horse is not Yeshua's horse. This is a false white horse. This is the anti-Messiah's horse, if you will, because he doesn't go forth healing. He goes forth conquering and to conquer. We're going to see this white horse again later. Now, in the second seal, Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, Come and see. And another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. If we take a look around us, we see that wherever Marxism, communism, or populism has been, there's violence, because the emphasis is on doing the will of the people, as in democracy, rather than on doing the will of Elohim. So this is the big difference. Now, we'll talk about this in another study called Torah Government, but Yahweh's model is a kingship model. And democracy, Marxism, socialism, it all ignores that. Revelation 6 and verse 5. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, A quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. This black horse represents basically the capitalist interest. It's moneyed interest. If you look at secular capitalism, we see the Rothschilds, the Bilderbergers, the International Monetary Fund, the Bohemian Grove, the United States Federal Reserve. These are the kinds of people who place the interests of money. Nothing wrong with money, nothing wrong with having wealth as a result of being rewarded for your labors. But these are people who place wealth before Yahweh. These are people who might be described as having hearts as black as coal. Revelation 6 and verse 7. And when he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, Come and see. So I looked, and behold, a green horse, And the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And power was given them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. The King James translators used the word pale for this fourth horse. However, if we take a look in the Greek source text, the word here is chloros. And chloros is the same word as from which chlorophyll comes from, and of course that's what makes plants green. Now it's very interesting. We're going to see these tribulation colors, white, red, black, and green, appear in almost all the Islamic flags. There's only a few that don't have these colors in them. For example, here's the Palestinian flag below. Now here's the Jordanian flag, again, white, red, black, and green. Okay. The Kuwaiti flag, white, red, black, and green. Take a look at the Syrian flag. I think we might be noticing a pattern here. Take a look at the Afghani flag, white, red, black, and green. Okay, we might be noticing a pattern. Now notice that green is Islam's primary color. For example, here's the Al Jazeera flag. Here's a Hamas headband, or it's also can be used as an armband, again with green. Here's the Hamas headband being shown. Now what we see up to this point is forces being released. We're going to see the stages being set for the events we're going to see during the tribulation. In the fifth seal, we're going to see the martyrs cry out. In Revelation chapter 6 and verse 9 says, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who'd been slain for the word of Elohim and for the testimony which they held. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Yahweh, set apart and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" Then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren, who would be killed as they were, was completed. Now we're going to see this is where the great multitude dressed in white comes from. A lot of saints are going to have to die during the tribulation period. Up until now, again, we're just setting the stage. Now seal 6 hasn't happened yet. What we're going to see is that at seal 6, things are going to start to break loose. Some possibilities, we might see a nuclear exchange somewhere in the Middle East or perhaps even in America. These are going to serve as a catalyst to further set the stage and peak events for the tribulation period. We know that there are many globalists or liberals who want to do away with national boundaries and do away with all the things that Yahweh ordained and establish a secular man-made New World Order with a global government. The secularists believe this is the only way to avoid nuclear war. And they feel that in order to avoid nuclear war, many, or if in fact most of the population, would be willing to accept a global government based on secular principles rather than on Yahweh's Torah. Just as a scenario, we're going to come back to this scenario later in the presentation, but just as a basic scenario or a what if. Now what would happen if there were a nuclear crisis in the Middle East at seal 6? And the UN were to ask the Pope to step in order to bring about peace and safety. What if they believed the Pope could broker such a peace deal because he had such close ties already with his friends in the Islamic world? What if we know the Pope is friends with the Muslims because he'd even kissed the Quran, saying that Islam is also a faith that leads to salvation? What if as part of such a peace deal, in order to bring peace to the Middle East, the Pope then moved his throne to Jerusalem? What if the Pope established a temple in Jerusalem and the outer court was open to all the Gentile religions of the world? And then the world's political leaders then hailed the Pope as a hero for bringing about peace and safety and this kind of religious unity. Would that fulfill 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting in verse 3, which says, "Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, because that day will not come unless first comes the falling away, and the man of sin," or we might say the man of lawlessness or Torahlessness, is revealed, the son of perdition, the one opposing and exalting himself over everything being called Elohim or object of worship, so as for him to sit in the temple of Elohim as Elohim, showing himself that he is Elohim. We're going to talk more about that scenario, but for right now, let's see what Revelation says about seal 6. Let's understand that Revelation is a vision. At which level are we going to interpret a vision? Are we going to interpret it on the physical level? We're going to interpret it on the spiritual level, or both? Now, I would say that as a minimum, we have to understand visions at the spiritual level. A lot of times people want to interpret prophecies and visions at the literal level only, but it's not always possible. For example, in Isaiah chapter 30 and verse 26, where it says, this is talking about a good period of time, It says, moreover, the light of the moon will be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun will be sevenfold, as the light of 7 days, on the day that Yahweh binds up the bruise of his people and heals the stroke of their wound. So this is a healing time. Yahweh's binding up the bruise of his people and healing the stroke of their wound, and yet the light of the sun is going to be sevenfold. So we know that has to be a spiritual interpretation, because if the sun's light was literally sevenfold times as strong as it is today, it would burn up all life on earth. So it has to be a spiritual interpretation. So let's take a look then at what do the various symbologies, what do they mean in Scripture. In Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, I looked and he opened the 6th seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake. Now I'm going to suggest that this is representative of societal unrest. This is a social quake, a societal quake. Things are changing in society. Government systems are changing. The people's attitudes and moods are changing about certain things. Just bear that thought in mind. Revelation 6 and verse 12, it says, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. Now, a lot of people are looking for a literal interpretation of this. If we take a look at the spiritual level, we can see how the sun could be symbolic of how Yeshua's Spirit shows us the way. The moon is symbolic of how the Torah lights our path. You know, you can do a better job if you read Scripture and you understand the commandments for what they say, and you walk according to what Scripture says. You can do a fair job of walking in the right direction. If you read the 10 Commandments, you know to honor your parents, you know not to murder, you know not to steal, you know not to provide false witness, you know not to do all these wrong, bad things. But you can't do nearly as good of a job walking according to the commandments as you can do walking according to his Spirit. So while the moon lights your way a little bit, the moon gives something of light to our path. Of course, the sun lights our path in broad daylight, and that's what Yeshua's Spirit does. Now we take a look for second and third witnesses of Scripture. Psalm chapter 119 and verse 105, it says, your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. In the occult, the black sun is symbolic of the Roman swastika, and it represents Roman power. I don't want to get too wrapped up with this at the moment, but if we just take a look at this, just again at the spiritual level, we know that Yeshua said, I have not come except for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So we know that those who are following him and those who have his Spirit are those who are following the Messiah. Now, while they may not be in the fullness of truth, we might take a look at those as the Messianics or the church, or, none of it. We all see through a glass darkly. But those are walking according to the light of the sun or the Spirit. Those who are walking according to the light of the moon, we might also see that they're symbolic. That's symbolic of Judaism. Now, if the sun and the moon are darkened, it may be that in the wake of a New World Order and a United Religions initiative, we're going to talk about this more later, with the Roman Church coming to full power, that the church, or the body of believers who follow Yeshua and those who are trying to follow actually what the Old Testament or the Tanakh says, that those become darkened. We're going to talk about that a lot more later. Revelation 6 and 13 says, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it's shaken by a mighty wind. We could see that these are nukes on a physical level, but probably we're going to see these are demons. And later on in the presentation, we're going to see that demons are represented by stars. Verse 12, then the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. In a nuclear exchange, where you have the mushroom cloud, that could be where the sky recedes as a scroll. And we're going to see later in this presentation that mountains are representative of governments and islands are representative of national boundaries. Now, mountains and islands are going to be moved out of their place because they're being broken apart to form a one world order. The government structures of this world that were instituted by Yahweh are going to have to be de-established in order to be reestablished or culminated as a secular one world government or one world order. It says, and the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and the rocks of the mountains. Could be a reference to nuclear shelters. It could also have a spiritual implication. And said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now we're going to take a look at the 144,000. It's sort of an inset chapter. Revelation chapter 7 and verse 1 doesn't belong to the timeline, but it belongs to this general point in time. After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living Elohim. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, until we have sealed the servants of Elohim on their foreheads. And I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. What we're going to see is the reason the 144,000 are sealed is as a protection against the trumpets. The tribe of Levi is left out, is included. Dan and Ephraim are left out, where the tribe of Joseph is substituted in for Ephraim. We don't really know why. We're also going to see a multitude that's dressed in white who do not survive the tribulation. Again, we saw this prophesied at Seal 5, where the saints were already told that just to rest and wait a little while longer until more of their brothers and the saints would be killed as they were. Revelation chapter 7 and verse 9, it says, And after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands. Now they're before the throne and before the Lamb, and the Lamb at this particular point is in heaven. And crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our Elohim, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. Then one of the elders answered, saying, Who are these arrayed in white robes, and where did they come from? And I said to him, O master, my master, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they're before the throne of Elohim, and serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. They shall neither hunger any more, nor thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them, and lead them to living fountains of waters. And Elohim will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So what we're going to see is that believers in every country are going to be killed in the Great Tribulation, or what's called the Great Distress. And they're going to go to be with Yahweh, while the 144,000, or the elect, stay here on earth and go through the ingathering and continue on and survive during the millennium. Many people fear being killed in the Great Tribulation, and rightly so, because surely we want to live. But the thing to remember is that we win either way. If we're killed in the Great Tribulation, we get to go be with Yeshua sooner, and we don't have to experience all the mess and see all the destruction and devastation that's going to take place during the Great Tribulation. Or if we do have to experience all the mess, then at least we get more time here on earth in order to serve Yeshua, and we still get to go to be with him afterwards. So we win either way. There's going to be a half hour of silence between Seal 6 and when the New World Order is set up in the trumpets. Revelation chapter 8, starting in verse 1, tells us, And when he opened the 7th seal, there was a silence in heaven for about half an hour. And this is about a half an hour of relative peace. Basically, in my understanding, what's going to happen is the UN's going to take control. Once there's been a nuclear exchange in the Middle East, the UN's going to give control of the Temple Mount to the Pope, and there's going to be a half an hour of relative silence until open warfare erupts during the time of the trumpets. Revelation chapter 8 and verse 1. And I saw the 7 angels or messengers who stand before Elohim, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. This is a societal quake. This represents changes in society. And so what's happening is, society is obviously changing because they're establishing the New World Order. So lots of societal change, lots of societal restructuring. As a lot of people have said, the pace of change is accelerating. Okay, and it says, So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The 7th seal is going to open the trumpets. Now the trumpets are the tribulation period per se. We're going to see a 7-year period of tribulation, with the time of Jacob's trouble being the second half of that 7-year tribulation. And the tribulation is going to affect the whole world, but it's going to be more intense in the land of Israel. We're going to talk about that in more detail in the next part of this video series.